All right, so let's turn together in our Bibles to Revelation chapter number 2. And as you're doing that, just to remind you of the two handouts. I think you all got those. So on the one side, the main handout on the one side has the outline for tonight, and then a couple of maps. We'll look at those in a few moments here. So Revelation 2, and we're looking at the 7 letters of Jesus to those ancient churches, those 7 ancient churches. And tonight, the church in Smyrna, which is modern-day Izmir in western Turkey. And one of my former seminary classmates is pastor there, so that's why I know that. Smyrna is Izmir, so on the western coast, just near Ephesus. So Revelation 2, verse 8 down to verse 11, and the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. So if you have the outline there, just note there again, as we thought about a couple of weeks ago, these 7 letters are Jesus, the ascended King Jesus' prophetic witness. Right, so this sounds to us like the Old Testament prophets, and he's witnessing to the 7 ancient churches there in that Roman province of Asia Minor, both to encourage them and to warn them. And I mentioned the outline, so just again, notice on the sheet there, if you were to read those 7 letters and kind of outline them on your own as you write that out, the first 3 letters exhort these first 3 churches, Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamum, and they use this refrain, he who has an ear, let him hear. And then they go on, these first 3 letters, to promise eternal life. So there's this exhortation with that refrain, then the promise. And then the final 4 letters, they reverse that order, right? So there's a promise of eternal life first, and then there's that refrain, he who has an ear, let him hear. It's just a way for them to, because again, this would have been read aloud and spoken. They would not all have a copy of their own Bible to turn and look with their eyes. They'd have to hear it. And so these are literary ways to write so that in an oral culture, things are a little bit more memorable, easy to follow, and they could kind of lump together, oh, okay, I've heard that refrain 3 times now, and then it gets reversed. Sort of a surprise as it's being read aloud, and there's 4 with that. So we're in the second letter, so we see there at the end, there's that exhortation, he who has an ear, and then there's the promise, okay? Verse 11, the one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. So just as something about Smyrna itself. So you have the other handout that has the maps. The first one we looked at before, the map of Asia Minor, right? We looked at it before. Does it look familiar? Anyone? Bueller? Right? It should look familiar. If you have like a little folder of notes, you should recognize that. So again, just notice there, the 7 churches are this little church building there. We looked at Ephesus, there's Smyrna. So this is a trade route. These are roads that would have been followed. So you can see how close Smyrna is to Ephesus, right? You can see that Smyrna itself, just like Ephesus, was in a port or a harbor, right? So it's in that little inlet area there. I mention that because we're not sure. The New Testament only mentions Smyrna once, and it's here in Revelation. So we're not sure from anywhere else in the New Testament how this church sprung up. But it stands to reason that I think it's Epaphras who's mentioned in some of Paul's letters. He was a preacher in Pergamum and Colossae and so forth in that region. So it would stand to reason that either Paul or John or one of their cohorts would have brought the gospel there at some point. So that's the second. letter that we're looking at. And on the back of that is a map of Smyrna. This is a recreation of what it looks like. As you can see there in the blue section, the water. You can see the line there that says today's shore. So again, over time there are earthquakes, right? Ancient cities fall. They would rebuild on top of the ruins. There's fill the water in. The waters would recede, right? I mean, oceans rise and fall. So there's the city, and you can see there's a theater there. There's an agora. It's a big marketplace. There's a stadium. What were the stadiums used for in those days? What was the big sport of stadiums? Was that? Well, theaters for orators, but a stadium would have been used for stadium, not for gladiators though. This is where the surf meets the turf down at Old Smyrna. You guys know the old song, right? Yeah, races. So they'd have chariot races. Chariot races, yeah. So like the movie Ben-Hur, yeah, there you go. So chariot racing was like the ancient sport. Okay, I mean there were gladiators and other things too, but chariot racing, of course, was the most popular. So they would have a hippodrome, right? A hippodrome is a horse racing track. Just notice that it's not as filled in as the last map I gave you, but a few things here and there. So a couple of things I mentioned about this city of Smyrna. It existed well before Alexander the Great. Around 600 BC, there was a kingdom called the Lydian kingdom that destroyed this city. And on the map, so there's Mount Pagos. That's where the city originally existed, up in this mountain. It's about 2 miles from the water there. Alexander, when he began to conquer, he came to this city and rebuilt it, but he moved it 2 miles to the west so that it would be on the water. It would be a port, an easier place to offload goods and soldiers. But then he died eventually, and he divided up Alexander the Great's great kingdom into 4 sections, and one of those became the Seleucid Empire. These were it's like modern day Syria, right? Like Antiochus was the family line of their king, and he wanted to control all this region. And about the same time, there was the Carthaginian Empire. You know much about Carthage and Hannibal and the elephants, right? Probably everybody knows about Hannibal and the elephants from the ancient world. And then there was a tiny little city that was like an up-and-coming city. So there's Carthage, there was Seleucids, and a tiny little city called Rome that wasn't yet a world power. And interestingly, this city of Smyrna, even before Rome became a world power and even before they conquered the Greeks, they pledged allegiance to the Romans. And they were the first city to build a temple to Roma, which was the divine city, the divine empire, the Roman Empire, even though it wasn't an empire yet. So they pledged their allegiance, and that was repaid to them over history. By the time of the 1st century, when Revelation is written and these letters are written, it had a population of about 100,000 people. Do you remember from 2 weeks ago how many people Ephesus had? 200,000, roughly speaking, right? So it's about half the size of Ephesus, but it's also on the same port trade route. Okay, so it's a very important city. Later, after the New Testament is written in the early 2nd century, so the 100s, this became a very important church because they had a very, very important bishop by the name of Polycarp. And Polycarp was one of the most famous of the early Christian martyrs. So anybody read Polycarp's letters? Yeah? So you can just go online there, you can read them for free. Just so John discipled Polycarp, who discipled a man named Irenaeus, who ended up in Lyon, which is in the south of France. So Polycarp was very famous. This is, of course, 100 years later, but very famous bishop and preacher of the city, and eventually was called upon to recount in the stadium. It was called Renounce His Faith. And he very famously gave a speech in front of the governor and all the people there's animals there, and they threw him to the lions, right? And he died for his faith. And very famously said, he was told, to renounce atheism, because they believed Christians were atheists. I don't know if you knew that or not, but ancient Romans believed Christians were atheists. Why would they think of them as atheists? Okay, they believe in one God, and not all the gods, but what about the one God that they would say they're atheists?
They didn't have physical presence.
Okay, yeah, so they didn't have images. They didn't have statues. Like, how can you worship your God if you don't have temples and shrines and physical stuff, right? I mean, if you want to worship Jupiter, it's pretty easy to go do that. If you want to worship the divine Roman Empire, it's pretty easy to do that. Like, whatever God you wanted to worship, it was very easy to do that. So they were called atheists because they didn't have any gods, like literal household gods or temples, shrines. So he was called upon to renounce the faith and to renounce his atheism. And then he gave us a very moving speech where he said, the Lord has, I've served him for 86 years. How can I deny him now? And then he gave his life up. So this is where Polycarp preached and ministered and pastored in Smyrna. So very important city in very early Christian history. All right, so let's look there at the outline. There's three little distinct sections. It's a very short letter. It's a little shorter than the one we looked at last time, where Jesus, first of all, identifies himself. And this is a standard, letter writing. Just like, you read Paul's letters, Paul, right, to the church in Corinth, right? So identification. I'm an apostle called by the will of God and so forth, right? Like, that's a typical ancient letter writing. And we might do the same thing. We might do it through text message, but we do the same thing. Like, I texted somebody this week, and it was like, my name's Danny Hyde. I'm Cyprian Hyde's dad, right? You got to somehow identify yourself, right? This is like a former NBA player. I'm trying to get him to help my son. So, got to identify, like, who's this random guy texting me? Well, my son is this kid. You probably heard of him. So, you identify yourself, and so Jesus then identifies himself in verse 8. So again, verse 8. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. Okay, who died and who came to life. It's interesting, too, that Jesus identifies himself this way to this particular church in this city, Smyrna. Smyrna is the Greek word for the embalming spice myrrh. Okay? So when a person would die, they would embalm their body with myrrh. It was an embalming spice, and so it's used at death. It's associated with mourning and sadness. And these Christians, as you can see, they needed to be encouraged in their earthly sadness, and so Jesus identifies himself with them because notice he's the first and last who died, who came to life, right? So he identifies with them in this church in this city that is named after the spice myrrh, and they are sad, we're told here. They're suffering in many ways, and so he identifies himself with them. And he called himself first and last. First and last. We saw this already, didn't we, in chapter 1? That language, first, last, somewhere? First chapter. Well, yeah, we've only been in one chapter, so it's got to be in the first chapter, right? And what do we see there in the first chapter? Well, if you just scan back to the first chapter, for example, verse 8, I am the Alpha and the Omega, right? It says the Lord God, who was and is to come, Alpha and Omega, and then that's God the Father is describing himself as first and last, or Alpha and Omega. Jesus is the same thing, verse 17. For now, I'm the first and the last, the living when I died, and behold, I'm alive forevermore. So I mentioned that Jesus identifies himself the same way the Father identifies himself, right? The Lord God. as the same. He's first, last, Alpha, Omega, beginning, end. So he wants to communicate to them that he is the eternal sovereign ruler of human history. First and last, right? Beginning, end, Alpha, Omega. And this takes us back to, we looked at a couple of times ago, this is from the Old Testament prophecy of Isaiah, this language of first and last, beginning and end, and that takes us all the way back to the burning bush. Exodus chapter 3, that same idea that God is the same, yesterday, today, forever. I am who I am. I'll be for you, Moses, and Israel, as I was before to Father Abraham, and I'll be to your kids after, the same as I was to you and I was to Father Abraham. So Jesus is trying to say to them, or he is saying to them, you are going through a time of trial and testing, but again, I'm right here upholding you. I am the first, the last. I'm in control. I'm God. He's also the one who died and came to life. Okay, so first, last, who died, came to life. And again, they are experiencing suffering, right? They are undergoing tribulation, verse 9. I know your tribulation, poverty, the slander. Don't fear what you're about to suffer. The devil's going to throw some of you into prison. You'll be tested. You'll have tribulation, and so forth. Okay, I'm the one who died, but I am alive. You might die too, but you will live. And that's what you see at the end there, right? The one who conquers won't be hurt by the second death. So everything that they are experiencing, Jesus is saying, I also experienced. Right? So that's the beauty of belonging to Jesus, is that he's a faithful and merciful high priest. He knows our sufferings. He knows our weaknesses. He's able to empathize and sympathize with us. He's walked in our shoes, and so we just merely walk in his footsteps. And knowing that not only the suffering side of it, but the life side, the glory side, the resurrection side. So he identifies himself. First, last, right? He's in control. He's almighty. He died. He came to life. Okay, so he's encouraging these Christians in this city named after the spice myrrh, this spice that associates itself with death and suffering. Jesus says, I have also suffered, but there's joy, right? There's glory with me. So that's the first thing, right? Identifies himself. Questions? Al?
Verse 9 said, slander,
Mm-hmm.
that they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. What is that?
Let me come to that. I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, I'll come back to that, yeah. Other questions? Okay. Second thing, then. So he identifies himself. Then notice he commends this church, just like we also read last time, 2 weeks ago, with the church in Ephesus. He also commended them. He knew their works. He knew their toil, their patient endurance. They tested those who called themselves apostles and so forth. So he commends them. Verse 9, verse 10. I know your tribulation, and so forth. Again, how can he know their tribulation? How can he know their poverty? How does he know that they are being slandered and so forth? He's with them. And what image does he give of his presence? Yeah, so he's walking amongst the candlesticks, right? And in his hand, in his right hand, he's holding these 7 stars. He's walking amongst the lanterns. So he's with them. And he's gone through this, right? So he knows. He knows. So again, they're experiencing poverty, persecution, barrenness, of sustenance, yet fullness of suffering. I know your tribulation, your poverty, but you're rich. That's why he said this is the richest church in the world, Jesus describes. Although they are poor, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they're Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So he identifies not only himself, but their suffering. When's the last time we saw like a best-selling Christian book on suffering?
That's what you rich.
Yeah, it's like, it's not a very popular subject, is it? You know, like we live in a very prosperous nation, and so, you know, anything that has to do with suffering and death and so forth, I mean, we just kind of want to push that away, right? But it's like front and center, this church. This church knew poverty and suffering, yet he says, you're rich. So just, you know, it's important for us. It reorients our perspective on life, that, you know, what we experience with the blessings that we do have is not the normal way that it's gone for most Christians in the history of the whole church. And most likely than not, it's not the way it is for most Christians anywhere else today. So, you know, we praise God for protection and all the tangible blessings, but let's not forget, as Hebrews tells us, those who are in chains, those who are suffering, and to remember them in our prayers. So he commends the church for its tribulation. Remember back in chapter 1, John said that he was a brother and a partner in the tribulation, right? So he is saying that this age is an age of tribulation, and he's joined in that with these churches. I know that, Jesus says. He commends their poverty. And that's important because in Roman society, you know, upward mobility, climbing the corporate ladder, so to speak, that meant that you had to take part in the rituals and the worship, the cult, the worship of the emperor, the empire, you know, whatever local, you know, deity. So you'd have, you know, the Roman gods and pantheon, but you'd also have your local gods. You might have a god, like a patron of Smyrna, and you might have a patron of your particular neighborhood, and your family might have a patron god or goddess, and of course you pray to your family, your ancestors. So you had to partake of all this stuff to move up in society. But because these Christians wouldn't, Jesus says, they chose to be poor. And they chose to follow Christ, which meant for them to be cut out of business dealings. And they chose not to partake in all the things of the empire. And so he says, I know your poverty, yet you're rich. So it does remind us of what Paul says in Corinthians, that God has not called, you know, many wise and powerful and those of noble birth and so forth, but God has chosen the weak and despised of society. James 2, verse 5, James says, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom? So, you know, this would have been real poverty for them, right? Like not just, you know, difficulties with our family because we become Christians, which is real enough. But this would have been literal poverty and choosing a life of poverty and struggle and suffering because you follow Jesus. But he says you're rich. But you're rich. So despite the earthly poverty, you are rich. And again, Paul said, 2 Corinthians 6, for example, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing yet possessing everything. That's how he describes Christians. As poor yet making many rich, having nothing yet possessing everything. And he says in 2 Corinthians 8, you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. Okay? Is that a health, wealth, prosperity promise? No. What does it mean by rich? Okay, and how is, like, what does it mean to be rich? Sure, we have faith in Jesus, but okay. So there's inherit the kingdom of God, right? So we have inheritance. And is that, like, why is that more valuable than earthly inheritance?
Eternal.
Okay, it's eternal, not temporal.
You're all end up in the same place. So having earthly inheritance is both have something. Whatever I gain on earth, I can't take it in. So why not go after the
doesn't Paul say we're coming to the world naked and we're going to leave it naked too, right?
The richness for the church, I think he's implying as well that how the church is conducting itself among each other. This reflecting genuine Christianity.
Yep, yeah.
While they're actually physically poor.
Yep,
But when he say rich, it only can indicate how close to each other, how
Yep.
faithful to the word, how all
Yep.
the stuff that he taught us through the age.
yeah. So not just eternal riches, which is true, but like we've been looking in Hebrews the last couple of sermons, this idea that they had all their stuff plundered, right? But yet they knew they had a greater inheritance, and therefore they loved each other, right? And they were spurring each other on to love and good deeds. So yeah, we have a real family. We have real love and experience real love one from another. So yet you're poor, yet you are rich. And Paul says, he would be willing to give up, everything, all of his riches, for the surpassing worth of knowing Christ, right? To know his sufferings, to gain Christ, to gain the righteousness that comes from God by faith in Philippians chapter 3. So, I know your tribulation, I know your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So there was great animosity as the time between Jesus' death and resurrection up to this point, over the decades, there became more and more separation, division, and animosity from synagogues, from the Jews who did not embrace the Messiah, Jesus, and because they saw Christianity as a threat to their own survival. So if you read ancient writings and so forth, Christianity was associated with Judaism, right? So they called them, they thought they were all Jews. And originally they were, right? And so they saw this as like an inter-Jewish debate, but it was upsetting society. And so when there's heavy-handedness that would come against synagogues because there were Christians there as well, it became an issue. And so the Romans called the Christians a sect, right? A little splinter group of Jews. And so Jesus says, there are some who say that they are Jews. And what does he mean by that? They say they're Jews. Well, yeah, sure. But they are ethnically Jewish, but they're not.
One's inwardly.
Yeah, as like Romans 2 says this, right? There is circumcision of the outward and the inward. So they say they're Jews, true enough, but they don't follow the Messiah, right? They don't follow the hope of the Jews and of Israel. And so, because they rejected him, right? So no one's a Jew who's merely one outwardly, Romans 2 says, Paul says, but a Jew is one inwardly. So it's sort of a bigger issue of Christian, Jewish relations. But the apostle, or Saul of Tarsus, he says that you can't only be Jewish outwardly, right? It's a matter of the heart.
And Jesus said the same thing to the Pharisees there in following the Talmud.
Yep.
If you believe Abraham, you should believe me.
Yeah, he calls them offspring of Satan. Jesus does, right? Those who rejected him. Those who rejected him. In fact, it's interesting, at this, around the first century, before and after, there were groups of Jews who were waiting for the Messiah, and we found these Dead Sea Scrolls, like out in the caves of Israel, and they had a little community called, one of them was called Qumran. It was these hopeful Jews. They separated themselves from the normal life of Israelite society, and they went out into the desert and lived in caves. And they called the Jews in Israel, in the various parts that were controlled by the Roman Empire, the congregation of Belial, right, the devil. So Jews were calling themselves. There was debate amongst Jews who really were Jewish. Because they believed that Herod and so forth, these were false kings, right? Because they just paid money and got protection from the Roman Empire. So this is not just, Christians saying this. There were amongst the Jews themselves debates about identity, right? Who were the real Jews, the real followers of the Lord, and those who hoped in the Messiah. And there would have been synagogues throughout the ancient world, in major cities, and again, Christians would have come from there. We see Paul in the book of Acts, when Paul goes on his journeys into various cities. Where does he always go first? He goes to synagogues, right? He's a Jew, so he goes to synagogues, and because he had reputations, at times he's allowed to get up and speak. Obviously, this means that in Smyrna there was an ancient synagogue, and there were those who were calling themselves Jews, but he says, they are not. But instead, they're a synagogue of Satan. They've rejected the Lord, right? They've turned their backs on him. So he not only commends them, but he also encourages them and consoles them. Do not fear, he says, verse 10, what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil's about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested. And for 10 days you'll have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. Right? So again, you're poor, but you're rich. So that theme. So there's three things that Jesus says here about suffering. First of all, suffering is a test, he says. That you might be tested, right? So the purpose to this suffering is that you might be tested. Secondly, suffering lasts only for a period of time. In this case, he says for 10 days, you'll have tribulation. Is that a literal 10 days or a metaphorical? I'm not sure. The point, though, is that it's limited. It's not forever. Do you know in the Old Testament who also was tested for 10 days? In the Old Testament,
David?
Not David, no. Famous test in Daniel chapter 1. Daniel and his 3 friends were tested for 10 days. Yeah.
Shadrach,
Yep. So Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, right?
Yeah.
They were tested for 10 days, right? Remember the test? The food test, right? Like, are you going to eat the stuff the king puts out, or are you just going to eat vegetables and water? And, okay, I'm going to come back in 10 days and see which ones, and the ones that are eating, like, the Ritz-Carlton buffet versus those who are eating scraps, right? Like, the scraps they look better in God's providence, right? And it's just interesting that there is in the Old Testament the same idea of a testing period. Who's going to be faithful? Follow the Lord, but eat kosher, because God gave laws about that, or compromise. So he says, you will be tested for 10 days of tribulation. And thirdly, notice suffering always results in glory, ultimately glory. I will give you the crown of life. The Stephanos, this is the crown that's, there's a couple terms for a crown. This is a Stephanos. It's a victor's crown. It's the wreath that was put on a person's head after a victory. So there's like a kingly crown, a gold crown, a jeweled crown and so forth. But it's also a crown of leaves. This was the victor's wreath. That was one of the biggest honors you could have, winning a victory. Whenever the Roman generals, or even later on the Caesar and emperor, when they would have a triumph, a big parade for the city, they wouldn't wear a crown, a golden crown. They would have the green leaves. That was the Stephanos, the victor's crown on their head. And that's the crown that Paul says is promised to us when he says, I finished the race. There's laid up for me a crown of righteousness. We think of like Burger King crown, right? Like gold crown with all these jewels in it. No, it's this crown. It's the victor's he identifies himself. He commends them. Notice that. So he commends them again. I know your tribulation, your poverty. I know your the slander. Don't fear, though, what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is going to throw some of you into prison. You'll be tested. For 10 days you'll have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Notice then he concludes with that promise in verse 11. So the formula, the little he has an ear formula, and then the promise. Notice there's an irony here. There's like, as you read that, there's an irony here. Notice the one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. Being conquered in death, right? If you were put to death for your faith, others conquered you. But Jesus says here, it's actually a victory. To die for Jesus is actually a victory. Being defeated in this life is winning for the sake of the gospel. Because death leads to further life, right? You leave the temporal and enter the realm of God's own life, the eternal realm. So that's the irony, right? And that's the thing that people don't get, that in the ancient world they didn't get. How it is that you can be so willing to be suffered, have yourself plundered, to die, to be conquered, to be plundered, and so forth, because you're looking forward to another life, right? Your death is not the end. Death is a victory, ultimately. So in particular, he promises here to believers who are faithful in this life to the end of their life, death itself, that he or she, the one who is faithful, will not be hurt by the second death. So there's some debate about this language, because it comes up again in chapter 20, the second death. The first death is obvious. What's the first death? Physical death, right? So that's the obvious. Okay, if I die a death for the sake of the gospel, that's an obvious, right? You're dead. That's the first death. But what's the second death? Later in chapter 20, for example, we read about the second death having no power over us. It's in chapter 20, verse 6. Chapter 20, verse 14. Then it's more clearly explained. The time will come when death and Hades will be thrown into the lake of fire. Finally, in chapter 21, verse 8, we read about all those who are outside the New Jerusalem, that they'll experience the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. So it's speaking, I think, of eternal condemnation. To be outside of the realm of the grace of God. And Christ's promise is that the one who overcomes, even dying, that the second death, everlasting death, won't hurt, won't harm you, because we'll be with him, right, forever. So we'll get to chapter 20 eventually at some point. There's different ways in which we can read it, but I think that's the clearest way to read it, at least in this context, chapter 2. So there's first death, which is temporal death. There's second death, which is more of a metaphorical death, because we don't believe that the souls don't go to sleep, right? Like, we don't believe in annihilationism. We don't believe that the second death means that, you stand before God and you're condemned, and then he snuffs you out, and then that's the end of it. Some say that. So there's a literal death. There's a metaphorical death. It's to be apart from the grace of God. Sometimes we hear people say, well, what is hell? Some people say, well, it's eternal separation from God. Is that true? Is hell eternal separation from God? The answer is no. Right? It's separation from the possibility of grace and mercy, but if we believe that God is just, then it's not separation from God. It's God's act of justice, right? Punishment. So that's the second death, right? The one who overcomes, that death will not harm you because you're not condemned. You've been justified. You've been glorified and brought into the presence of Jesus on good terms, on reconciled terms. So, any comments or questions through verse 11? We'll stop. So good. You picked up on that. So remember last time I said that there's a pattern, a typical pattern, right? There's this identification, there's a commendation, some kind of a warning, and a promise. We saw that with Ephesus, right? So you have the identification, that's the first verse. He commends them, verse 2, verse 3, but he warns them, right? Verse 4, there's a more serious part to it. He recommends them again, verse number 6, and then he gives the promise, verse number 7. It's interesting, Smyrna doesn't have a warning. Right? There's no warning here. Why not?
Because they were going through a nightmare of persecution.
So that's the irony, is like the church in Ephesus. Remember, Ephesus was like one of the top cities in the ancient world. A rich city. And Smyrna, again, important, but not as much. It's just interesting how the church in Ephesus would have been, in that sort of context, very, very wealthy context like ours. And there's a warning. Smyrna, not so much, not to the same extent. Temptations are always there, but they are being persecuted, right? They are described as poor, yet you're rich, right? It's a different kind of riches. So this letter is a letter of commendation, of encouragement, calling them to persevere, giving them hope, giving them joy in the middle of suffering. So it's interesting that pattern is not followed here. So we can take from that this is a very healthy church. Right? Even though they're outwardly not successful, they are a very healthy church, and the Lord commends them for that and blesses them for that.
David Steele in his commentary says a possibility of poverty is also the imposition of fines for them not participating in some of the temple worship.
Yeah, it could, yeah.
Worship, and so
Sure.
they had their goods confiscated, there
Yeah.
were fines imposed, and that could have been part of their property.
Yeah, so there could have been fines imposed for not partaking of whatever rituals were going on. Loss of business, because you wouldn't. I mean, you would walk into a shop and there would be some kind of an altar, probably. You walk into somebody's house, there'd be a little altar. I mean, there are altars. I mean, they're everywhere in the ancient world. So almost everywhere you walk and go, you cross a threshold from this part of town into the agora, the marketplace. There's probably going to be, on all four sides, some kind of an altar with incense, or put food on there, or, And so Christians, it was difficult, and it was obvious who were the Christians and who were not just by watching people, right? So, there would have no doubt there would have been that's a part of it. The loss of properties and the loss of even just the potential to move up because they were being faithful to Christ.
Was part of their false religion also ancestor worship?
Yeah, the Romans worshipped ancestors. Yeah, prayed to them, asked them to help them.
I think that kind of was brought into the Roman Catholic Church from that too?
Oh, no doubt. Over time, that the practice of invoking saints. I mean, it has commonalities to ancient practice of looking to ancestors, right, and people that have gone before you, in your family. So, other questions or comments?
Can be deceiving them, can be hurting. Said about what you just explained, that
Yep.
watch out for these guys.
Yep.
So he's being direct to them, that he's helping them to open their eyes and be watchful what
Yeah, so it's not just Roman, Roman master, right? Civil, we might say, civil life, even though it's more than that. But also those who were Jews who came out of the synagogue, no doubt have family, friends, co-workers, neighbors, right, in synagogues. And because that pressure is being brought upon them because of Christians, they become another sort of thorn, right? Whether it's like pushing them away or whether it's, kind of sort of ratting them out,
More than
Yeah.
sometimes.
So, questions? Other questions before we move on? All right. So next time we will be in the next letter, Lord willing, a couple of weeks from now, chapter 2 again, Pergamum, the third church in the letters.